And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Farhan, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying of the body. Over the last couple of episodes, we've really started to build out a framework for understanding who David is in redemptive history. There are so many narratives that often focus on his valor or courage or be like David. And we find that if we rightly understand scripture, that we come to a much different understanding of not only his significance, but ultimately how he points to Jesus. And so we're going to continue that exploration today as we dig into Sacred Space and Promise, David's Early Reign, Part 1. With that in mind, too, Kid would love to kick it off and just really helping us understand how many theologians view Saul as a failed man. Redemptive history, however, presents a much different perspective, illuminating a stark contrast between the two possible forms of human dominion. What are those forms, and then how do they differ, and then why are they utterly incompatible?
Well, I think the starting point again is, as you said, we tend, certainly with the Bible, to read these stories of individuals as kind of focused on who they are, what they did as individuals. Were they faithful? Were they not faithful? Were they obedient? Were they disobedient? And so we kind of treat these stories and individuals almost as a kind of religious Aesop's fables, if we can use that expression, where these individuals have some lesson to teach us. It's kind of the Sunday school approach to things. Like you said, be like David because he was courageous, or David trusted God and David fought his battles successfully, and Saul was this and Saul was that. But really, we have to think about these characters as they contribute to the larger story and ultimately to God's purposes for the world as those purposes are worked out through these individuals. And that's this idea of history as the redemptive history. So in terms of David and Saul, I think what's important for us to kind of start with is the recognition, as you asked even in the question, that they do represent what are really the only two possible forms of human dominion or human lordship. For all of the different forms of human government or kings or, presidents or whatever different ways of structuring human leadership or authority, we're not really talking about that as much as two ways in which human beings can manifest the kind of lordship for which they were created. And that gets us to this idea of the procedure of the king, as we've talked before. And if our listeners recall, when Israel wanted a human king to be like the other nations, it was that desire that resulted in Saul being picked to be the first king of Israel. But God had said, whoever you pick, that king will rule according to the procedure of the king. And that expression was defined as that human ruler using his authority, his power, his lordship to take everything that was under his authority and use it to his own advantage. In that text, it says that he'll take your young men to fight his wars for him, and he'll take your daughters to bake his bread and clean his palace, and he'll take the produce of your fields and your flocks to fill his own table. So essentially, he's going to take what you can bring to serve his own dominion, to serve his own empire, his own aspirations. Well, that's the procedure of the king. And God said, whoever you pick, that's what it's going to be. The alternative to that is for human beings, as I said, to actually exercise dominion in the way that God created them to. We're back to the garden now, and this idea of man as image bearer, his priestly and regal function, where man is to essentially be the administrator of God's dominion. So rather than serving, a human ruler serving in his own right for his own agenda, for his own aggrandizement, he is actually administering God's lordship as a son, as a servant, bringing God's mind, God's wisdom, God's love, God's intentions to bear in the world. And those two forms are utterly incompatible in that one represents human lordship as man was created to be Lord over God's works, and the other represents human lordship in the context of human alienation, estrangement, self-determination. So in that sense, Saul represents human rule according to the procedure of the king. And the text wants you to see David in a different sort of way through this designation of being a man after God's own heart.
Yeah, one of the words that you mentioned here is utterly incompatible, but yet we know from prior episodes that David and Saul did have a relationship. So, kind of speak how we reconcile those. And in fact, Saul at times exploited and saw value in David furthering his own efforts. And so, how do we reconcile those two when in fact we too have two very distinct, different forms of dominion?
Well, I suppose there's lots of ways in which that was the case. The two individuals, Saul and David, did have a close relationship for a while, and Saul was favorable towards and actually, in a certain sense, loved David when he saw in David a servant of his own good. Saul saw in David someone who could further his kingdom, his well-being. Uh, David was obviously the one who fought the battle with Goliath and dealt with that Philistine problem on behalf of Saul and the people of Israel. So he was a servant of Saul's kingship and Saul's kingdom. And then even later, when Saul became a tormented man because God was pulling the kingdom away from him, David's ministry to Saul through music and he became a comforter, a source of comfort for Saul. And so Saul saw value in him in that. But over time, Saul began to see David as a threat, even as the people sang the song of how Saul had slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul began to become jealous and he felt threatened. And now he sought to kill David. Even in giving David his daughter, he had an agenda in that he required that David bring him 100 Philistine foreskins in exchange for his daughter, Michal, to be David's wife. And his intent was that David won't be able to meet that demand. He'll get killed by the Philistines. So there was a disingenuousness, a desire to kill David, even in this thing of making him his son-in-law. But through all of that, you see David representing a different kind of relationship with Saul, where even after he was anointed by Samuel and told that God was giving him the kingdom, as we discussed, David spent many years continuing to recognize Saul's kingship and referring to him as the Lord's anointed, and refusing even when he had the opportunity to kill Saul. When Saul was pursuing him and constantly seeking to kill him, when David had a chance to solve the problem and kill Saul, even under the encouragement of David's own men, David refused to do that. He said, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. And so David wasn't jealous of Saul. David wasn't seeking to use Saul to his own advantage. And in fact, when Saul is killed, David mourned greatly. He lamented. It was something that was very upsetting to him. And even the messenger who brought the news to David of Saul's death, David put him to death. He was so upset by this situation. So David presents a very different picture of the relationship of these two men. And again, it's this fundamental idea of an orientation in power or authority or purpose that is defined by God's mind and God's love and God's will, as opposed to the self-seeking, selfish agenda that's associated with power. And we see this in the human world. I mean, throughout the ancient world, when a person came to the throne, that was a good thing. But then that person was always looking over his shoulder. And often, even as recently as the 20th century, you have rulers who will kill everybody, even in their own family, who might possibly present a threat or a usurpation
Mhm.
possibly of the throne. And so once you come to power, you get rid of everybody who might possibly be a threat to your power. Well, that was Saul. And that's the way that human beings exercise lordship in their natural state. David represents a different form, even though, as we're going to see, um, he still was very much a man who, in the final analysis, did have these aspects or qualities of ruling according to the procedure of the king. David was not yet ultimately the kind of human being, human lord, human ruler that God intends for human beings.
Yet, human existence finds each person determined by self-centrism that has oneself at the lens engaged through which all life is perceived and assessed. Describe how this paradigm relates to the interplay between religion, which we've spoken about in past episodes, and kingdom, and in what ways is this interplay the same and different in the ancient and modern worlds?
Well, the reason for putting together these ideas of religion and kingdom, what in our culture we might call, the difference between the secular and the sacred and the separation of church and state, all those kinds of issues. Should religion be in the public sphere? Should the government in any sense be intermixed with the practice of religion? But this is a modern phenomenon in the sense that throughout all of human history, there was no separation between religion and daily life, religion and politics, religion and kingdom in that sense. And people groups which were gathered in this thing called a kingdom or a social structure associated with rulers and structures of law and power, all of that was overarched by religious consideration. And you see this in the scriptures that in the ancient world, people had their own cultural, ethnic, national gods, the gods of Babylon, the gods of Medo-Persia, the gods of the Assyrians. And those gods were thought to be committed to those people groups. And so when two nations or kingdoms went to war, they viewed it as a conflict between their gods and our gods. And if we prevail in battle, it means that our gods are greater, our gods are stronger. You can see this like in Isaiah 10 and in the book of Jeremiah with respect to the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the way that they viewed their conquest of Israel and then Judah in the south as the triumph of their gods over the gods as they viewed it of Israel. So religion and kingdom always go hand in hand. We say, well, that's not true in our culture. Well, it is in the sense that even in America, we might not we might say we have a secular society, but we have our own religious practices or religious ideology, the things that we in a sense hold out as idols or things of devotion, whether they're institutions or cultural phenomena or whatever, but they become a part of how we define ourselves and our culture. And so this idea of divine powers or certain things that are available to us and then work for us become localized within different cultures. And I'll just conclude with this. We see this even in Christianity, even coming through the period of the Reformation, that you have armies lined up, Christian armies lined up on the battlefield against each other, both armies raising the banner of God. We are God's people fighting for God's cause against these other people
Right.
who are enemies of God and enemies of God's kingdom. So this intermixing or defining a political state or a civil society by its religious convictions and by its sense of it's God being faithful and devoted to it is very much a part of human culture. But that has this self-centrism at the center of that.
Curious to many, David experiences a gradual winding ascent to the throne defined by hostility, opposition, and division. Compare and contrast his anointing as king of Judah to that of Ishbosheth over Israel and what it reveals about God's patience and purpose in his redemptive designs.
Well, Ishbosheth was Saul's son, and when Saul and Jonathan died in battle, Abner, who had been Saul's chief of staff, if we want to use that term, he was kind of the commander and like the right-hand man to Saul. Abner took Saul's son Ishbosheth and just declared him to be the king of Israel. And so now you have a replacement for Saul. When Saul died, all of the kingdom, the 12 tribes of Israel, didn't come over to David. And again, David had been anointed by Samuel at least a decade earlier. And through all of those years, even though God himself had said, David is my king, and I've rejected Saul, David didn't rule as a king. David lived in caves and fled and was constantly in hiding and fearing for his life, or running for his life at least. And Saul continued to preside as king in Israel. And so when Saul died, that didn't change. Abner simply took Saul's son and said, he's now the king in Israel, in defiance of that anointing of David and God's own intent for David. So David, once again, did not go and say, no, I'm the king, and go and have Ishbosheth killed. In fact, David, first of all, only presided over the single tribe of Judah, the tribe that he was descended from, and that was at Hebron. So you still had a divided kingdom. And that continued for 7.5 years, with David being king in Hebron over just this one tribe. And throughout that period, there was war between the house of Saul and between the house of David. And it's kind of a long, winding story of how ultimately Abner came over to David and began to try to bring all of the tribes of Israel to rally around David, and Ishbosheth was murdered. And so, but even then, it was this process before David finally became king of all Israel. And as far as what this kind of, again, the picture of David as portraying the way in which God works and ultimately what God's true king would be, this slow, patient, faithful, trusting process is what God requires of people. And God doesn't act instantaneously. He doesn't always make it known where this is going or what's going to happen. He wants us to trust him. He wants us to entrust ourselves to him. And that was very much David's course. David wasn't going to seize the kingdom. He was going to wait on God's timing, on God's purposes to be fulfilled. He never doubted what God had declared and determined, that he was the rightful king of Israel, but he was going to wait for God to bring that to pass. And ultimately, that even speaks to the Messianic king, the son of David, Christ himself, who attained to his own kingship and the inheritance of God's kingdom and his own exaltation through a long process of patient suffering, dealing with injustice. The temptation of Jesus in the wilderness was one of those aspects of temptation was, I'll give you all these kingdoms, just fall down and worship me. You can have this right now. And Jesus said, no, that's not how it works. So, but even as it was true in Jesus, it's true for all of God's people, that this process of growing and being formed and matured as sons is a process of patience and a process of trust.
Indeed. How did David's response to Abner's death help him secure the favor of all Israel and demonstrate that he was a man after God's own heart? And Kid, like we might even want to go back a little bit and give our audience some context on what we mean by a man after God's own heart. Because I think if we're not careful, we can actually import too much meaning into that actually is not biblical.
Right. Well, fundamentally, that expression is the antithesis of the other expression, procedure of the king.
Right.
And the text makes that clear because Saul, God said, when you pick this king, he's going to rule according to the procedure of the king. And you see what that looks like in Saul's experience. And God takes the kingdom from him and says, I have found a man after my own heart. In other words, someone who won't rule in that sort of a way. So it speaks to the fundamental orientation that David had. Again, once again, this idea of trust, of patience. David wasn't seeking a name for himself. He wasn't seeking to establish his greatness in the earth. He wasn't at the center. His concerns, his interests, his glory, those things were not at the center of how he viewed the kingship, how he was going to go about being the king of Israel. It always was centered in, I am the shepherd of God's people. Yahweh is king in Israel. I'm ruling in his name. And that doesn't mean that David didn't fail in any way. We're going to see that he does fail spectacularly. He too ultimately is not this true king, this man after God's own heart in the ultimate sense. David does manifest the same dynamic of the procedure of the king, but he is kind of presented as the contra Saul. He's presented as a different sort of king. Saul represents human kingship in its natural form. David represents man as administering God's lordship in his name, in his authority, according to his agenda and his interests. And that's this idea of a man after God's own heart. And you see this with the Abner episode, in that, again, Abner, who was Saul's right-hand man, when he abandons Ishbosheth, the man that Saul's son, that Abner had essentially established him as the king. He was the kingmaker that put Abner on, or put Ishbosheth on the throne. But when he got sideways with Ishbosheth, he came over to David and he met with David, and then essentially said, I'm with you. I'm going to bring the sons of Israel to you. Well, when Joab, David's right-hand man, found out about that, he went and killed Abner. He said, he's a spy. He's seeking to undermine you. You can't trust him. And so he kills Abner, and David is furious about that. And then even when two men murder Ishbosheth, once Abner was bringing Israel over to David, the people of Israel, the other 11 tribes, could see that Ishbosheth's reign was falling apart, and people were abandoning him. And so two of the commanders who had been commanders of Saul assassinated Ishbosheth, and they brought his head to David and thought David would be thrilled. See, your opponent has been taken out. This threat to you consolidating reign over Israel has been taken away. And David was furious, and he killed them. And he honored Abner, who had been killed by Joab, and he took Ishbosheth's head and actually had it buried in the same grave where Abner was buried. And so David, through all of that and through his sadness and his lamentation over these men, the people around him, the Israelites around him, saw that he was this kind of a man. Any normal king would rejoice that somebody had dealt with an adversary for him. David wasn't pleased with that. He wasn't pleased when Saul died. He wasn't pleased when Abner died. He wasn't pleased when Ishbosheth was assassinated. He called him a righteous man, an innocent man. And the people saw that heart and that orientation in David, that this was really about honoring the Lord and not building his own empire. And that was a way in which he began to win the hearts of the people over to himself. And the text will go on to say that when David consolidated all Israel under his reign, it wasn't through military conquest or threats or fear. It was through love. He bound their hearts to him. They saw him as that sort of a man after God's own heart, a king who was serving the Lord's interests and not his own.
Yeah, like I think it's really important just to stem one thing that you said for our audience is that so often, if we're not careful in just doing a deep character study, and as we alluded to earlier, right? Saul represents this, David represents this. we fail to realize too that not only are they actual characters in biblical history, but they actually represent worldviews. And like I love that you really stamp that too, and they represent realms of thinking, and that these things exist at a much higher plane than just their day-to-day lives and affairs too,
Right.
which is so dangerous for us just to read this as if it's just an episode in an action flick and not understand too that God has a much bigger purpose in not only what he's saying through how he's using them in this narrative, but ultimately what they're pointing to and speaking to as well. So I appreciate you elevating that. Kid, as we kind of wrap our episode today, one of the things that came up as people read through the notes, which might have shocked them, is that we introduced this idea of shepherd, which has not been in previous episodes. Speak to this a little bit. In what way can David be rightly described as a shepherd of Israel based on his kingdom on his kingdom consolidation efforts, how did he begin to reflect in, how does he begin to reflect the true David, even in the infancy of his reign?
Well, this concept of shepherd as being indicative of rulership or kingship really comes to the fore in David. God even says, David was a shepherd. When Samuel came to Jesse's house to discover under the Lord's leading which of Jesse's sons is to be the king that he's to anoint, he looks over all of them, and then God says none of them, and Samuel says, well, do you have any other sons? Well, the youngest, he's out there tending the sheep. So at the very beginning, David is presented as a shepherd. He takes care of his father's sheep. And God says of David that I took you from shepherding the sheepfold to shepherd my people Israel. And that becomes an important idea associated with the kingship in Israel, that the kings are shepherds under Yahweh, who is the chief shepherd. And this kind of comes to a sharp point, among other places, in the 34th chapter of Ezekiel, where God finds fault with the shepherds of Israel, the leaders, the rulers, not just the kings, but the priests and the prophets, those who have a leadership authority role in Israel, because they're abusing the sheep. They're abusing them, and God says, I will no longer allow you to be shepherds over my people. I will come and I will shepherd them. So Yahweh, who is the great shepherd of the sheep, has human shepherds who are to shepherd his people in his name, in his authority. The sheep belong to him. And Israel was his sheepfold that these rulers were to tend as shepherds. And these ideas come to a focal point later, obviously, in relation to Jesus and even John 10, I am the good shepherd who cares for his sheep. And Jesus contrasts the hireling with the true shepherd. And in that world, men would hire themselves out essentially as laborers, contract workers to care for somebody else's sheep. And he says the hireling doesn't care about the sheep. He's just doing this for his own personal gain. He's doing it for his wages.
Right.
And so when there's a threat, when there's a danger, when the bear comes or the lion comes, the hireling runs away and he leaves the sheep to be devoured because he doesn't care about them. And Jesus contrasts himself with the hireling as the true shepherd who cares about the sheep. And he says, in fact, I lay down my life for the sheep. The shepherd cares for the sheep in that way. But this idea of the kings being shepherds under Yahweh, who is the shepherd of his sheep, and shepherding it has these connotations of protection and feeding and leading, Psalm 23, and the Lord is my shepherd and leading me to still waters and causing me to lay down in green pastures. It's a tending, caring, nurturing,
Right.
protecting function, as opposed to an overlording
Right.
or hireling sort of function. And so it's appropriate that that idea comes to the forefront with respect to the kingship in Israel in relation to David, because fundamentally he was that kind of a king. He was a man who served the people of Israel as an under shepherd under Yahweh, the chief shepherd. And ultimately, later on, Peter will talk about the elders of the church as being under shepherds, caring for the flock under Christ, the chief shepherd. So these ideas become very important in the development of Israel's history, reaching their focal point and true fulfillment in Jesus, as you said, the true David who is to come. He is ultimately and perfectly that shepherd ruler that David prefigured. And ultimately, then the leaders in Christ's church are to be shepherds of that sort. They are presiding over Yahweh's sheep. He is the king, and Yahweh is king over his people in the Messiah. So Jesus, the true shepherd, administers his lordship through his appointed leaders who are under shepherds caring for his flock.
I would also add too that when we hear sheep, we tend to associate that with like an inherent waywardness, maybe not
Mm-hmm.
incompetence too, but something that will require instruction and correction to bring them back to the
Right.
fold as well. And so we can see
Exactly.
that this analogy metaphor is so rich and so deep and so appropriate in so many ways too. And I really appreciate you unpacking that and building that out too as well. We sincerely hope this time that you've shared with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode where we'll continue to build on David's early reign. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.